Hey, welcome to Info 3370, studying social inequality with data science at Cornell. This is spring 2023, and we're on our second class meeting today, where we're discussing Christopher Jencks' 2002 paper, Does Inequality Matter? So hopefully you've had a chance to read this paper before class, and in class we were able to discuss some of the highlights in the paper. There's a few learning goals for today. In particular, at the end of this class, you should be able to make a normative claim about inequality, make an empirical argument about inequality, and recognize cultural views that might conflict with empirical distributional facts about how incomes are distributed in the United States and elsewhere. I want to begin with Table 3 from the Jencks paper. In this table, we can see evidence about the purchasing power of people at various positions in the income distribution. I've highlighted just a few countries from the table. So first, let's compare the UK and the US. This number at the left here is a number for someone at the 10th percentile of the income distribution. So we're going to think about a person in the UK for whom 10% of the population has a lower income, and a person in the US for whom 10% of the population has a lower income. And what Jencks is choosing to highlight in this table is that that person at the bottom of the distribution in the UK can purchase only 85% as much stuff as the person at the same place in the US income distribution. Then if we move over a column, Jencks points out that the person at the 90th percentile in the UK can purchase only 68% as much stuff as the person at that same top end of the distribution in the US. And so this is nice because it's a comparison of how much you can buy at various points in the distribution, and thus it abstracts from differences between, say, dollars and pounds. And so given this evidence, there's a question. Where would you rather live, in the UK or the US? Given just the information in the table, it seems like it's pretty reasonable to choose the US, because no matter if you're at the bottom of the distribution or the top of the distribution, you can buy more stuff if you're in the US than if you're in the UK. Now let's throw another country in the mix. So in the text, he highlights this fact about Canada at the time that the paper was written. Now in Canada, the person at the 10th percentile of the distribution can actually buy 5% more stuff than the person at the 10th percentile of the US distribution. Meanwhile, the person at the 90th percentile can buy only 80% as much stuff as the person at the 80th percentile at the 90th percentile in the US distribution. And so now I want to ask the same question. Given this information, and just this information alone, where would you rather live, in Canada or the US? In other words, which one has a better distribution of income? So if you think about this question, it gets hard, because you have to decide where income matters more. Is Canada better than the US because the people at the bottom of the distribution can buy 5% more stuff? Or is Canada worse than the US because people at the top of the distribution can buy 20% less stuff? We have to make a trade-off whether that extra 5% at the bottom is more important than the loss at the top. This is a useful exercise because it highlights that part of this claim is empirical. It's about quantitative numbers that can be estimated from data. And part of the claim is normative. So the empirical part here is all the numbers that appear in the table. Like, he went and got data and looked at what people in Canada could buy, people in the US could buy. The normative part is whether one distribution is in some sense better than the other distribution. And the normative part is about like who deserves to have the ability to buy more stuff than other people, and what kind of distribution would we want from society, ideally. I want to turn to these normative questions. I like how he gives this example of the manna falling from heaven. So this is an example from the Hebrew Bible in which the Israelites were in the desert, and in the story, God rained down manna from heaven. So it's like bread falling from the sky. And this is a nice example because no one worked for their manna. It just fell from the sky. And thus, we don't have to think about who deserves manna based on their work, but just what distribution of the manna would maximize overall societal welfare. Jencks, in this part, takes a utilitarian perspective and thinks about the total welfare in the population. He makes two suppositions. So first, assume the manna dropped from heaven, so no one worked for the manna. Second, assume diminishing returns. So each additional pound of manna yielded a progressively smaller increase in the recipient's well-being. In other words, when I go from having 0 pounds to 1 pound of manna, My well-being has improved a lot because I was starving and now I have some food. But when I go from 9 to 10 pounds of manna, it doesn't matter that much because I already had kind of a lot of manna to begin with. So given only these two suppositions, he then argues that we can make a reasonable argument about how we ought to distribute the manna in this case to maximize well-being. In fact, what we ought to do is take from the person who has a lot of manna and give it to the person who has very little, because reducing a little bit of your large amount of manna at the top only harms your well-being a little bit. But giving a little bit of manna to someone who has almost none at all is really beneficial to them. And when you take this to its extreme, the ideal distribution of manna in this case would be to give everyone an exactly equal amount of manna. So then we could turn to an empirical question. So what distribution do we actually have? In this table, he's reporting several stats about countries that compare the income distribution in all of these different countries he's studying. And I want to focus here on this first column, which is the ratio of household income at the 90th percentile to the 10th percentile. So again, remember that we have a distribution here where we have people sorted by income with the highest incomes at the top and the lowest incomes at the bottom. Then imagine we take two people in that distribution, the person for whom 90% of people earn less and the person for whom 10% of people earn less. Then imagine we take the incomes of those two people and divide them. So here we get the 90-10 income ratio. What this ratio tells us is that in Sweden at the time of this study, the top of the income distribution earned 2.6 times as much as the person at the 10th percentile of the income distribution. Meanwhile, in Italy, for instance, the person at the 90th percentile earned 4.8 times as much as the person at the bottom of the income distribution. And in the US, the 90th percentile income was 5.6 times as much as the income at the 10th percentile of the distribution. When we look across all of these high-income countries, the US stands out both for its high ratio of the 90th to the 10th percentile of income, and thus high level of inequality, and also its high GDP compared to all of these other countries. And some have argued that the high level of inequality in the US and the high level of economic growth in the US go hand in hand. But Jenks suggests that there are other reasons for the high level of GDP in the US, and he also points out that when you remove the US from this equation, it's not clear across countries that high levels of inequality are related to high levels of economic growth. Finally, I want to just touch a little bit on cultural views that might seem to conflict with the facts. In the US, there is a strong value placed on equality, and you hear this in music and in art and in history. And this seems to disagree with the fact that incomes are just very unequally distributed in the United States. So to see this cultural view, we could go all the way back to the Declaration of Independence, which says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We could also look to Alexis de Tocqueville, a French aristocrat who came to the US in the 1800s and went around and compared what he saw in this land of democracy to the old land of aristocratic Europe. And he thought that really equality was very central to the American ideal. He wrote, "Democratic communities call for equality and freedom, and if they cannot obtain that, they still call for equality and slavery. They will endure poverty, servitude, barbarism, but they will not endure aristocracy." So to de Tocqueville, something that was really special about the US was that everyone was on an equal playing field, and we no longer had these lines of nobles who inherited advantages from their birth. Jenks also has a quote on this point, which I really like myself. He says, "American politicians present themselves to the public as being just like everyone else. And once they step outside their offices, Americans all wear jeans." And here he's highlighting how there's this cultural notion in America that everyone has a chance, and we're all equal to begin with, and everyone can survive and succeed if they just try hard enough. And I just highlight that this stands in contrast, and I think Jenks would also highlight that this stands in contrast with the vastly unequal distribution of income in the US. We'll get more into that as the semester goes on. So I want to close here by recapping our learning goals. By the end of class, you should be able to make a normative argument about inequality. So this, for example, uses that utilitarian argument about the distribution of the manna. You should also be able to make an empirical argument about inequality. For instance, summarizing countries' income distributions by the 90-10 income ratio. And finally, you should be able to recognize cultural views that may seem to conflict with distributional facts. This class was unusual in that we started out the semester talking about this big think paper about inequality. In the next class, we're going to start working directly with R, which we're going to use to analyze information about inequality in a quantitative way to produce visualizations. So before the next class, you should go install R on your machine and be ready to go start learning in R. So thanks, everybody. That's it for today.